Gross borrowings are the total amount of money that a government borrows from the market to finance its budget deficit. A budget deficit occurs when the government spends more than it earns in revenue. Gross borrowings are different from net borrowings, which are the gross borrowings minus the repayments of previous loans. Why do gross borrowings matter for the economy? Because they affect the interest rates, the public debt, and the fiscal space of the government. Let's see how. First, gross borrowings affect the interest rates. When the government borrows more from the market, it competes with the private sector for the limited pool of savings. This pushes up the demand for money and raises the cost of borrowing. Higher interest rates make it more expensive for businesses and consumers to invest and spend, which can slow down economic growth and inflation. Second, gross borrowings affect the public debt. When the government borrows more, it adds to its outstanding debt. The public debt is the total amount of money that the government owes to its creditors. A high public debt can create fiscal risks and vulnerabilities for the economy. For example, if the creditors lose confidence in the government's ability to repay its debt, they may demand higher interest rates or stop lending altogether. This can trigger a debt crisis and force the government to default on its obligations. Third, gross borrowings affect the fiscal space of the government. Fiscal space is the difference between the current level of public debt and the maximum level that is sustainable in the long run. A higher fiscal space means that the government has more room to borrow and spend in times of need, such as during a recession or a pandemic. A lower fiscal space means that the government has less room to borrow and spend, and may have to resort to austerity measures, such as cutting spending or raising taxes, to reduce its debt. In summary, gross borrowings are an important indicator of the fiscal health and performance of a government. They have significant implications for the interest rates, the public debt, and the fiscal space of the economy. In this video, we will explore how gross borrowings slipped in Q1 and what this means for our moral dilemma. What are the moral dilemmas involved in borrowing more or less during a crisis? Borrowing is a common way for governments, businesses, and individuals to finance their spending and investment needs. But borrowing also involves obligations and risks that may have moral implications, especially during a crisis. One moral dilemma is whether borrowing more during a crisis is justified by the greater social good or whether it is irresponsible and unfair to future generations. Some may argue that borrowing more during a crisis is necessary to stimulate the economy, support vulnerable groups, and prevent further damage. Others may contend that borrowing more during a crisis is unsustainable, inefficient, and burdensome for future taxpayers and creditors. Another moral dilemma is whether borrowing less during a crisis is prudent or selfish. Some may argue that borrowing less during a crisis is wise and virtuous, as it reduces debt and preserves fiscal space for future needs. Others may claim that borrowing less during a crisis is cruel and short-sighted, as it worsens the recession, increases inequality, and neglects public goods. A third moral dilemma is how to allocate the borrowed funds among different purposes and beneficiaries. Some may argue that the borrowed funds should be used for productive investments that generate long-term returns and benefits for society. Others may insist that the borrowed funds should be used for immediate relief and assistance to those who are most affected by the crisis. A fourth moral dilemma is how to repay the borrowed funds in a fair and efficient way. Some may argue that the borrowed funds should be repaid by those who benefited from them, or by those who can afford to pay more taxes. Others may suggest that the borrowed funds should be repaid by cutting spending or by restructuring or canceling debt. A fifth moral dilemma is how to balance the rights and interests of borrowers and lenders in a crisis. Some may argue that borrowers have a moral duty to fulfill their loan agreements, as reneging on promises is disrespectful to oneself and others. Others may contend that lenders have a moral responsibility to show leniency and solidarity with borrowers in distress, as enforcing contracts is insensitive and oppressive. These are some of the moral dilemmas involved in borrowing more or less during a crisis. There are no easy answers to these dilemmas, as they involve complex trade-offs and value judgments. However, by recognizing and addressing these dilemmas, we can hope to make more informed and ethical decisions about borrowing in times of crisis.